The one thing they never wanted you to see are these tapes. For 7 years, a hidden camera was pointed at a secret location on a hill, a place no one knew about, a place marked by a heart made of stones. An investigator was waiting. He wasn't looking for a kidnapper. He was looking for proof of a performance. And then, the lens caught them, returning, not to search, but to check. This is not the story of a missing child. This is the story of a perfectly concealed secret. The truth has been buried for far too long. Hit like and subscribe right now. We are about to pull this whole performance apart. 7 years. In the grand, turning scale of the world, it was but a moment, a brief passage of seasons. For the media, the story had long since cooled from a raging fire to dull, glowing embers, stoked only by the occasional anniversary or a fleeting, unsubstantiated sighting. The headlines had moved on. The public's focus shifted to newer, fresher tragedies. The case had become a ghost, a piece of cultural folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by parents. But for Bernd Stellander, it was not cold. It was not history. It was a mechanism, intricate and precise, that he had been turning over in his mind for 7 years, examining each cog and spring, feeling for the one piece that did not fit. Stellander was a man built of procedure. His former life as a military police investigator had not been one of dramatic confrontations or inspired hunches. It had been a life of paper, of reports, of timelines, and of the unwavering belief that the truth, no matter how well hidden, always left a trace. It left a disturbance in the sequence of things. It created a friction, a sound that only a person trained to listen for profound, structured silence could hear. And the official story of this case was, to his ears, deafening in its flawless silence. He sat not in an office, but in a space defined by the investigation itself, a room given purpose only by the files stacked in meticulous order. He lifted the first bound report, its weight familiar in his hand. He had read these pages perhaps 100 times, maybe more. He no longer read them to find a clue. He read them to understand the architecture of the story they told. The official account was a masterpiece of dreadful simplicity. It was anchored, bolted to the calendar, on the night of the 3rd of May. That date was everything. It was the point zero from which all investigation had begun, the moment the world had been invited in. The narrative was stark. A warm evening in a holiday resort. A group of friends, the circle as he called them in his own notes, sharing a meal and conversation. Children sleeping nearby. A series of checks, routine and reassuring. And then, a moment after 10 in the evening, the discovery. A window open, an empty bed, a void. It was a story built on the terrifying randomness of an external predator. A narrative of a perfect night, shattered by an intruder. But the neatness of it, that was what troubled him. The chaos of the event, the screaming, the panic, the immediate arrival of authorities, all of that was human and real. But the timeline before the discovery, the framework upon which the entire abduction theory rested, was too clean. It was too perfect. Stellander's focus was not on the panic. It was on the calm that preceded it. He laid out the initial statements from the circle of friends, the other adults at the table that night. He placed them in a row, comparing the phrasing, the timing, the emotional temperature of their words, all given in the immediate, chaotic aftermath. He saw not the fractured, contradictory recollections of a group experiencing a sudden, horrifying trauma. He saw harmony. He read the first statement. A check was made at 9:15. All quiet. He read the second statement. A different member of the circle recalled seeing the check. He read a third. It corroborated the calm of the dinner, the rotation of the checks. They were all so certain. Their stories meshed, locking together like fitted stones, creating a smooth, impassable wall. They all confirmed the children were safe, sleeping, accounted for, right up until the moment they were not. This, Stellander knew, was not how human memory worked in a crisis. In his years of service, he had learned that 10 witnesses to a single, sudden event would produce 10 different stories. One would remember the sound, another the color, another an unrelated detail. They would mistake the time. They would argue about the sequence. Truth, in a moment of trauma, was a shattered mirror, with each person holding a different, jagged piece. This was not a shattered mirror. This was a polished one. He reread the statements, this time listening for the dissonance. It was faint, but it was there. Not in the major facts, but in the tiny, insignificant details. One member recalled a specific time for a check. Another recalled it being nearly 20 minutes later. But both agreed on the result of the check. All was well. One remembered the apartment door being closed. Another was certain it had been left slightly ajar. To the original investigators, these were simply the understandable fog of a stressful memory. They were minor, irrelevant discrepancies. To Stellander, they were cracks in a rehearsal. These were not the mistakes of people trying to remember. They were the errors of people trying to recount. They were the slight stumbles of actors who had all learned the same script but had personalized their lines. They remembered the purpose of the scene, to establish that the child was safe on the 3rd of May, but fumbled the minor stage directions. The question that had lodged itself in his mind 7 years ago returned with the force of a physical impact. Why did this group of friends, in the midst of the most terrifying night of their lives, all tell a story that was so incredibly, so structurally, cohesive? His training offered only one chilling explanation. They were not recalling a sequence of events. They were corroborating one. This realization shifted his entire perspective. He was not looking for a lost child. He was looking for the origin of a story. He pushed the thick binders detailing the events of the 3rd of May to one side. They were the performance, the elaborate stage play presented to the world. They were noise, a complex and brilliant diversion. The 3rd of May was not the beginning of the tragedy. It was the beginning of the narrative. If the 3rd was the day the story began, then the real event, the moment of truth, must have happened before the script was written. His hand moved to a much slimmer file. It was a file he had compiled himself, containing every stray mention, every passing note about the day before. The 2nd of May, a day that the official investigation and the world had dismissed as entirely irrelevant. A normal, quiet, forgotten day of sunshine and routine. Stellander opened the file. His pulse was slow, his focus absolute. He was no longer a detective searching for a culprit. He was an archaeologist, and he was about to dig beneath the foundations of the pristine, perfect timeline. He began to read, searching not for what had happened, but for what had been so carefully and so silently buried. Stellander's focus contracted, pulling away from the noise of the 3rd of May, a day he now saw as a sprawling, complex piece of misdirection. The truth, if it was to be found, resided in the silence that came before. His hands moved with a trained, unhurried precision to the binders he had compiled himself, bypassing the voluminous reports of the official search, the sightings, the theories, the frantic activity. He was interested in the mundane, the overlooked, the discarded. His attention settled on a single, slim file. It was a file that, in the context of the sprawling international investigation, was laughably thin. It was labeled, simply, May 2nd. To the original inquiry, this day was a void. It was the last full day of normalcy, a day of sunshine and holiday routine, a day that held no forensic interest because the crime, as defined, had not yet occurred. It was a non-event, a blank page. But Stellander had learned that in cases of profound concealment, the blank pages were often the most important. They were not blank by accident. They were blank by design. Within this thin file, 2 distinct items, 2 pieces of data separated by years and context, lay waiting. To anyone else, they were unrelated, stray facts. To Stellander, they were the 2 poles of a terrible hidden battery. The first was not a police document at all. It was a public artifact, an excerpt from the mother's own memoir. This book was a document he had studied with the same rigor as a police report. It was a story told years after the event, a narrative crafted with the benefit of time, reflection, and the careful guidance of editors and legal advisors. It was, by its very nature, a controlled document, a presentation. And yet, in that controlled presentation, a single, wild, and devastating phrase had survived. In a passage detailing the family's final normal day, the day before the reported alarm, the mother had written of the 2nd of May. She had paused in her narrative to give that specific evening a title. She called it, with a resonance that vibrated off the page, the night of all nights. Stellander had read this line perhaps 1,000 times. It never failed to stop him. The phrase was a monument. It was a marker of absolute defining trauma. It was the kind of name one gives to the worst moment of one's life. The night of before becomes an after. But the timeline was wrong. Why would the 2nd of May be the night of all nights? Why would this quiet, unremarkable evening, officially recorded as ending with sleeping children and a quiet apartment, be given this catastrophic emotional weight? The defining catastrophe, the one presented to the world, had occurred on the 3rd. The discovery of the empty bed, the scream in the night, the arrival of the police, that should have been the night of all nights. For this phrase to be applied to the 2nd was a profound chronological contradiction. It was, Stellander believed, a psychological imprint. It was a truth that had slipped past the censors of memory and law, a subconscious confession embedded in a public document. It was a gravestone for a tragedy that had been officially misplaced in time. A memoir, unlike a frantic, immediate statement to the police, is a curated object. Every word is weighed. For that specific, dramatic, and contradictory phrase to exist, to have been written, reviewed, and published, was, to Stellander, a sign. It was a leak of the highest order. He let the weight of that phrase settle. Then, he turned his attention to the 2nd item in the slim file. This one was a police document, but it was not from the main report. It was a copy of a log entry from the original Portuguese investigation, a note buried deep in an annex, a supplementary file of peripheral communications. It was a footnote. The note was dated the 1st of May, 2 full days before the reported disappearance. It detailed that the mother had been in a state of distress on that day. The child, it noted, had been crying persistently. Not just fussy, but crying in a way that had unsettled the parents. A way that was causing a problem. A way that was difficult to manage. The child was struggling to sleep. And then, the core of the note. On that same day, the 1st of May, the mother had made a private telephone call. The call was not to local authorities or hotel management. It was to a doctor, a personal friend, back in her home country. The log did not contain a transcript of the call, only the fact of it, the date, and the participants. But Stellander had cross-referenced this with other investigative notes, with whispers and internal memos. The alleged content of that conversation was known. It was a discussion about the child's persistent, inconsolable crying. It was a plea for advice, and it allegedly included a discussion about options for sedation, a query about a possible remedy to help the distressed child and her exhausted parents finally find some rest. Stellander looked at the 2 pieces of information, now psychologically fused in his mind. On the 1st of May, a deeply distressed mother, a persistently crying child, and a private conversation with a medical professional about sedation. A day later, the 2nd of May, an evening described by that same mother as the night of all nights. A new, dreadful hypothesis began to assemble itself in Stellander's mind. This was not a theory of intruders or predators. This was a theory of a tragic, common, and profoundly human mistake. What if a remedy was administered? What if, in a moment of desperation and exhaustion, a medical decision was made, perhaps with the best of intentions? What if the dosage was miscalculated? What if the child had an unforeseen, terrible reaction? What if the parents, themselves medical professionals, had woken on the morning of the 3rd of May, not to an open window, but to a silent bed? The implications of such an event would be a cascade of pure, ice-cold terror. They were not just parents, they were doctors. An accidental overdose, a death caused by medication they administered, would not just be a personal tragedy. It would be a professional catastrophe. It would be prosecution, scandal, the end of their careers. the end of their lives as they knew it. Viewed through this lens, the events of the 3rd of May snapped into a new, horrifying focus. The frantic calls, the coordinated, synchronized statements from the circle of friends, the creation of a unified, unshakable timeline, the immediate, unwavering narrative of an abduction. It was not the discovery of a crime. It was the concealment of an accident. The 3rd of May was not the moment the tragedy occurred. It was the moment the performance began. A desperate, brilliant piece of theater designed to hide a truth that had already happened. A truth that had been sealed, forever, in the silence of the apartment, on the date that would be forever seared into the mother's memory as the night of all nights. Bernd Stellander's investigation now pivoted, moving from the cold, hard architecture of the timeline into the far more volatile and fluid territory of human psychology. His central hypothesis, that the child had passed away on the 2nd of May and the abduction narrative was a desperate, immediate fabrication, rested on the belief that a secret of such magnitude could not be perfectly contained. He understood that a simple lie, told once, might hold, but a lie of this scale, a constructed alternate reality that had to be lived and performed every second of every day by multiple people under the relentless scrutiny of the world's media and police, was different. Such a lie was not a shield, it was a pressure vessel. It would, inevitably, begin to leak. Stellander was not looking for a confession. He was looking for the crack. He was searching for the psychological exhaust, the moments where the unbearable pressure of the concealed truth vented itself in ways the conscious mind could not control. In dreams, in emotional inconsistencies, and, most critically, in unguarded slips of the tongue. He began a methodical review of all peripheral data surrounding the parents in the immediate aftermath. He was not interested in their official, curated press conferences. He was interested in the margins, the private notes of liaison officers, the psychological assessments, the casual observations of those assigned to support the family. He found it buried deep in a supplemental report filed by a police liaison officer. This officer was not an interrogator but a support specialist, a person whose job was to be an empathetic ear, a shoulder to lean on. And in that context of perceived safety, vulnerability had emerged. The report detailed, in neutral language, a conversation with the mother. It described her as being in a state of profound, cyclical distress, one that went beyond understandable grief and into a realm of acute, restless agitation. In a moment of private anguish, she had confided in the officer. She told the officer she was having a recurring, vivid dream. It was not a vague nightmare of monsters or a falling. It was a vision, specific and repeating. In the dream, she did not see her daughter alive. She did not see her being carried away. She saw her in a fixed, final state. She saw her, in the dream's dreadful, silent clarity, as buried. The dream, she reportedly explained, was not just an image, but a place. She could feel it. She described it as a specific, sloped hill, a location she felt she knew, a place that was accessible from the resort, a place that overlooked the sea. Stellander read the entry, his focus absolute. On its own, he had to clinically acknowledge this was not definitive. It was trauma. The mind of a grieving parent, tortured by the unknown, would naturally gravitate to the worst possible, most feared outcome. It was a manifestation of horror, a simple, tragic product of a psyche under siege. He filed it, initially, as just that, a psychological artifact of grief. He continued his research, moving forward in the timeline, cataloging the family's public statements. Weeks later, he found the second piece of the puzzle. A fragment of this story, the rumor of the mother's dark dream, had been leaked to the press. It was a minor, ghoulish detail in the sprawling media circus. A journalist, seeking a reaction, had confronted the father with this specific rumor. Stellander hunted for the official response. He found it in several newspaper archives. A direct quote attributed to the father, an official denial intended to quash the rumor. The father had stated, forcefully and clearly, "It's not true that Kate had a dream she was buried somewhere." Stellander read the sentence once, then a second time, then a 10th. A cold electric jolt of comprehension passed through him. The denial was wrong. It was a profound psychological error, a catastrophic failure of the mind's internal censor. Stellander, in his years of training, had learned to listen not just to what people said, but to what they failed to say, and what they inadvertently revealed. An innocent person, when confronted with such a bizarre and morbid rumor, would have denied the premise of the story. They would have reacted with anger or confusion at the invention of the dream itself. The natural, protective response would be, "That is a disgusting lie," or "She never had any such dream," or "What a sick thing to invent." They would have attacked the story. The father had not done that. He had, in that critical, unguarded moment, accepted the premise of the dream's existence. He did not refute the dream. He refuted its content. His mind had bypassed the accusation. Did she have a dream? And instead, it had zeroed in on the single, terrifying, operative word within it, the word buried. In his haste to deny, he had engaged with the word. To Stellander, this was a classic tell. It was the response of a mind that did not hear a fantastic rumor, but a mind that heard a threat word. The word buried was not, to his subconscious, a random, morbid piece of journalistic fantasy. It was a concept that was already present, a concept that was loaded, dangerous, and real. He was not denying a dream. He was preemptively, reflexively, denying a reality. The denial, intended to shut down a line of inquiry, had instead acted as a powerful corroboration. He returned to the liaison officer's report. The mother's dream was no longer, in his mind, a simple artifact of grief. The father's specific, linguistic error had recontextualized it. It had charged it with a terrible, new potential. Perhaps the dream was not a fantasy of a feared outcome. Perhaps it was a memory. Perhaps it was the fractured, traumatic, and unspeakable truth of a real event, a real place, a real action, bubbling up from a part of the mother's mind that could no longer maintain the pressure of its containment. The father, in his clumsy attempt to protect the story, had confirmed the significance of its most dangerous word. The investigation was no longer purely abstract. It was no longer just about a date on a calendar. The psychological leaks had, Stellander believed, provided a map. The word was buried. The location was a hill, overlooking the sea. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to stop analyzing the reports. He had to go to the place. He had to see if the location from the mother's fractured memory was real. Bernd Stillander's investigation now made a critical leap. It transitioned from the abstract realm of psychological theory, linguistic analysis, and buried reports to the physical world. He was no longer an analyst reviewing a cold case from a distance. He was a field investigator, and he was on the ground. The word from the dream, buried, and the location, a hill overlooking the sea, were his only guideposts. He did not wander. He did not leave it to chance. A man of his background understood that a location, especially one chosen for a terrible purpose, is never random. It is selected based on a strict set of criteria. His task was not to search every hill, but to first define the profile of the correct one. He began, as always, with maps. He obtained detailed topographical surveys of the entire resort area and its surroundings. He was not a tourist looking for a viewpoint. He was a strategist looking for a liability. He began to filter the landscape, not by its beauty, but by its utility for concealment. His first filter was the dream constraint. The location had to have an orientation that overlooked the water. This eliminated a significant portion of the inland terrain. His second filter was seclusion. The location could not be on a public path, visible from a road, or adjacent to another property. It had to be a place one could go without being seen. It had to offer a guarantee of privacy, not just for a single act, but for potential return. His third filter was accessibility. This was the most critical. The site could not be a grueling, hours-long hike into remote wilderness. A person in a state of panic, grief, or secrecy, perhaps operating in darkness, would not choose a location that was physically prohibitive. It had to be reachable. It had to be a place one could get to on foot from the resort, do what needed to be done, and leave. all within a manageable time frame. He cross-referenced these 3 filters. He drew circles on his maps, highlighting several potential zones that fit the parameters. They were few. He had now, in his methodical way, narrowed a vast landscape down to a handful of specific, searchable areas. He began the physical reconnaissance. He walked the perimeters of the resort, testing his own accessibility theory. He dismissed the first potential zone quickly. A public path ran too close, making it too high risk. He dismissed the second. The undergrowth was too dense, the access route too difficult, making it impractical. Then, he found the third zone, and at the edge of it, he found the path. It was not a path that was advertised. It was not on any tourist map. It was a desire line, a faint trail created by animal crossings or the occasional, adventurous walker, now mostly overgrown. It was a route that suggested discretion. He followed it. The path climbed, winding away from the resort. It was not a difficult walk, but it was a hidden one. After several minutes, the path opened into a small, natural clearing. It was perfect. It was completely shielded from view by rock formations and dense brush, yet it was not a frightening place, and from its edge, one could, just as the dream had stated, see the water far below. It fit every parameter. At first, he saw nothing. Just undisturbed earth, rocks, and wild-growing flora. He felt a momentary pang of failure, a thought that his logic had, perhaps, been a fantasy. He began to scan the ground with the trained eye of a man who looks for things that are wrong, for the small, unnatural details that betray human presence. And then he saw it. It was not a thing, but a pattern. Near the center of the clearing, a collection of grapefruit-sized stones had been arranged. This was not geology. This was not the random scatter of a rockfall. They had been placed, one by one, with deliberate care. His eye followed the unnatural curve. It was a heart, a small, simple, almost childlike heart, laid out on the dirt. A cold, clinical certainty began to settle over him. This was not a game. This was not a prank. This was a symbol. It was an act of emotion, an act of grief. He knelt, his gaze now sweeping the area within the heart. His breath caught. Beside the stone heart, almost touching it, was a second arrangement. This one was made of small, dry twigs, the kind that littered the ground. But these were not scattered. They had been gathered, broken to size, and interlocked with a painful, precise neatness. They formed a letter, a capital M. This was the signature. The heart was the emotion. The M was the intent. This was not for a lost pet or a random sorrow. This was for her. This was a memorial, a marker of identity. He remained still, absorbing the weight of this. A secret shrine, a place of private mourning. And then he saw the third and final item. It was the one that elevated this from a sad memory to something else entirely. Resting gently just inside the curve of the stone heart, placed as if on a pillow, was a single flower. It was a pink rose, a color he associated with the missing child's campaign. But the flower was not the crucial detail. Its condition was. The flower was not wilted. It was not dried and brown from days or weeks of Sunday. It was fresh. Its petals were soft, and it was still holding a trace of moisture. It had been placed here very, very recently. Stellander stood up, moving back carefully, ensuring he left no trace of his own. The implications of this discovery were profound and immediate. This was not an old, forgotten site. This was an active site. The person who had built this memorial, the person who had laid the stones and the twigs, was still coming here. They were returning, tending to this secret place, refreshing the flower. This, Stellander knew, was the final, devastating piece of his behavioral puzzle. The public narrative, the one played out for the cameras, was one of searching, of desperate, forward-looking hope. But this hidden, secret place, told the opposite story. This was an act of mourning. This was a ritual of goodbye. You do not build a secret shrine on an unmarked hill for a child you believe is alive and will be found. You build it for a child you know is gone. You build it for a child you have left. He documented the location meticulously, taking photographs from angles that would not reveal his position, careful not to disturb a single stone. He marked the coordinates in his private log. He gave the location a simple, functional designation, the one it would carry through all his future work. He called it Spot 1. His investigation had irrevocably changed. He was no longer looking for a theoretical location. He had found it. Now, he was no longer just an investigator. He was a sentinel. He knew, with an absolute and chilling certainty, that the person who tended this shrine would be back. All he had to do was wait. Bernd Stellander did not touch the flower. He did not disturb the heart of stones or the twig-formed letter. He documented, he measured with his eye, and he retreated, leaving the small, silent clearing as undisturbed as he had found it. But as he walked back down the faint path, his mind was not retreating. It was lunging forward, synthesizing the fragmented pieces of his investigation into a single, terrifying, and coherent whole. The fresh flower was not a clue. It was a conclusion. It was the final, critical piece of data that confirmed his central hypothesis and, in an instant, altered the entire course of his inquiry. The timeline flaw, the sedation call, the night of all nights, the buried dream, the linguistic slip of the denial, all these were abstract theories. But the fresh flower was a physical object, a tangible link between the present moment and the secret keeper. It was forensic data of the highest order. Its freshness proved that the site was not a historical artifact. It was not a memorial left once in the immediate, raw aftermath and then abandoned to time. The freshness proved that the site was active. It was being tended. Someone was returning. This fact, this simple, observable fact, was the key. Stellander, drawing on his long and methodical military police background, began to formulate his core theory. He did not believe in conspiracies. He believed in behavioral patterns. And the pattern he was seeing here was a profound and profoundly damning psychological contradiction. His mind began to construct a formal profile. He called it, in his own notes, the innocent hopeful paradigm. This was the expected, observable behavior of a parent who genuinely believes their child has been abducted and is still alive. This parent searches. This parent hopes. This parent's entire psychological focus is on recovery. They would, Stellander theorized, preserve the child's room as a shrine of hope, not create a new, hidden one of mourning. They would clutch the child's favorite unwashed toy, desperate to retain the scent, the DNA, the last living link. The very last thing they would do, the psychological impossibility, would be to build a symbolic grave. To do so would be to accept a loss they are publicly and privately fighting to deny. To lay stones in the shape of a heart on a remote hill is an act of closure. It is an act of goodbye. Then he defined the second profile, the one he was now witnessing. This was the guilt-grief paradigm. This profile was for a parent who knows the child is gone. This parent is not searching. This parent is mourning. But this grief is not simple. It is contaminated. It is complicated by secrecy, by concealment, perhaps by direct involvement or an irreversible, tragic error. This parent cannot mourn publicly. There is no official grave to visit, no casket to weep over. The public narrative they have constructed, the abduction, the search, has imprisoned them. They are forced to perform hope for the cameras, while their private, true, and terrible knowledge has nowhere to go. And so, Stellander reasoned, that knowledge leaks. It demands an outlet. That unbearable, unshareable grief compels the individual to create a substitute. They are drawn, by a force stronger than their own fear, to a place of significance. Perhaps it is the last place they saw the child, or, and this was his chilling thought, it is the place of final concealment. Here, in secret, they can perform the rituals they cannot perform in public. They can weep, they can apologize, they can mourn. They are not searching for their child, they are connecting with their child. Stellander saw Spot 1 as exactly this, a necessary psychological theater. It was a displaced act of penance. This was what he termed the silent pilgrimage. It was not a gesture of justice-seeking, but of inner, psychological reckoning. When a person returns, again and again, to the site of a loss. Not for answers, but for connection. It is rarely, if ever, innocent. Innocent people, he knew, avoid the place of trauma. Guilty ones, or those who feel a crushing weight of responsibility, are drawn back, not to hide, but to grieve in the only way they are allowed. The heart of stones, the M of twigs, the pink rose, these were not just symbols. They were, in his view, a form of psychological reframing. The parent who committed these acts was, on some level, romanticizing the grave. They were turning a place of dark concealment into a hallowed, sacred spot. It was a way to emotionally reframe their own narrative, not as a concealer of a tragedy, but as a mournful, solitary protector of a sacred secret. The implications for his investigation were total. The global search was irrelevant. The child was not in another country. The truth was not in another country. The truth, Stellander believed, was tied to this small, specific patch of earth. And the person who knew that truth was coming back. His entire strategy shifted. He was no longer a historian, digging through old files. The case was not cold. It was lukewarm. It was active. He now had to become a silent watcher. His purpose was no longer to theorize why. His purpose was to document who. He could not risk returning too soon. He could not, under any circumstances, be seen. He could not report his findings, for who would believe a theory so radical, based on a handful of stones and a single flower? He needed objective, irrefutable proof. He began to plan, his mind moving with military precision. He would need equipment. He would need covert surveillance. He would need cameras, hidden, patient, and precise. He would not be setting a trap for a criminal. He would be setting a watch for a pilgrim. The investigation was no longer about the past. It was about the ritual. And he, Bernd Stellander, would be the only one watching. The execution of the surveillance was a procedure of extreme risk. Bernd Stellander was not a state-sanctioned investigator. He was a lone actor. He had no warrants, no backup, and no authority. If he were discovered, at best he would be dismissed as a delusional conspiracy theorist. At worst, he could be arrested for interfering in a high-profile case, an act that would not only end his inquiry but also potentially destroy the very evidence he sought to gather. He understood that his approach to Spot 1 must be as meticulous as his theory. He spent days planning the insertion. He acquired the equipment. Multiple, small, battery-powered cameras, weatherproofed and designed for wildlife observation. Their motion activation sensors were key. He could not, and would not, sift through months of empty footage. He needed them to record only change, only movement. He chose his time. It had to be a period of guaranteed low activity, a window of near-zero probability that anyone else would be in the area. He moved in, carrying only what he needed. His movements were slow, deliberate, every step measured. He was a ghost, not a man. He did not disturb the shrine. He left the heart of stones, the twig M, and the now wilting flower completely untouched. To disturb them would be to alert the pilgrim that their private sanctuary had been violated. Such a shock would guarantee they never returned. Instead, he focused on the periphery. He placed his devices with the patience of a sniper, seeking angles that were both comprehensive and invisible. One camera was positioned low, disguised among rocks, aimed directly at the small clearing. A second was placed higher, monitoring the faint desire path that served as the only practical entrance. He was not just watching the shrine, he was watching the approach to the shrine. He tested them, masked his tracks, and then he left. And so, the wait began. It was the hardest phase of any investigation. The silence. The days stretched into a week, then two. His entire theory, his entire professional reputation, even if only to himself, rested on the data stored on those small, hidden cards. He made his first retrieval, again in the dead of night. He returned to his base, his hands steady as he loaded the data. The first review was a crushing, monotonous disappointment. Thousands of files, all false positives. The motion sensors had been triggered, but only by the movement of animals, or perhaps the shifting of brush in a strong wind. There was nothing. No person, no pilgrim. He reset the equipment. He waited again. Another 2 weeks passed. The doubt, which he had so clinically suppressed, now began to surface. Had he misread everything? Was the flower a fluke? A single, isolated act of mourning by someone, perhaps unrelated? Had the person responsible simply moved on? The ritual completed. His entire case, which had felt so solid, so grounded in behavior, now seemed thin, resting on nothing but a handful of stones and a single linguistic error. He went for his second retrieval. He felt the cold weight of failure approaching. He swapped the data cards and returned, expecting another cycle of empty frames. He began the review. Again, nothing. File after file of empty, silent footage of the clearing. He fast facilitated through the timestamps, his eyes aching from the monotony. He was hours into the review. Then, he stopped. There was a file. It was not a false positive. The timestamp was clear. The motion sensor had captured a large, human-sized object. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, functional, not cinematic. It did not need to be. A figure was walking up the path. The person was alone. The person's movements were not hesitant, not exploratory. The figure moved with a quiet, certain familiarity, the gait of someone who had walked this exact path before. The figure entered the small clearing. It was her. It was the mother. Stellander's breath locked in his chest. His theory was no longer a theory. It was an observable fact. He watched, motionless, as the silent film played out. She did not arrive with media. She did not bring family. She did not come to raise awareness or to post a missing flyer. She came, as he had predicted, in absolute secrecy. Her behavior was the antithesis of a searcher. She did not scan the horizon, her eyes sweeping the hills for a sign of a lost child. Her focus was entirely downward, fixed only on that small patch of earth. She went directly to the heart of stones. She knelt. The camera's resolution could not capture her expression, but her posture told the entire story. It was not a posture of hope. It was a posture of profound, private, and contained sorrow. She knelt there for several minutes, her form still. She seemed to be in a state of absolute, internal focus. Then, she reached into her pocket. She produced a small, indistinct item. He could not make it out clearly. Perhaps another flower. Perhaps a small photograph. She placed it gently, almost reverently, onto the center of the stone heart. She lingered. She did not weep, or at least, her body did not shake with sobs. It was a static, terrible stillness, the grief of a person who had wept all their tears long ago. This was not a raw, new pain. This was a ritual. After several minutes, she stood. She looked at the shrine one last time, turned, and walked back down the path, disappearing from the frame. Stellander did not move. He sat in the darkness, the single, silent video file looping on his screen. The woman on the tape, kneeling at a secret shrine, was the same woman who, on the world's televisions, insisted her daughter was alive and would be found. The contradiction was absolute. He had it. He had the proof. The pilgrimage was real. He saved the file, labeling it with a simple, clinical designation. The visit had been captured. He had his pattern. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that this was not the behavior of a parent suffering an abduction. This was the behavior of a parent visiting a grave. Bernd Stellander's surveillance of Spot 1 had yielded a profound breakthrough. He had visual, time-stamped evidence of the mother engaging in a ritual of private, secret mourning, a behavior pattern that stood in stark, irreconcilable opposition to the public narrative of a parent searching for a living child. The camera, his silent, patient witness, had confirmed his silent pilgrimage theory. But this was only one half of the parental unit. He now turned his meticulous attention to the other half, the father. If the mother's behavior was defined by secrecy, the father's, he found, was defined by a strange and calculated publicity. Stellander widened his net, moving from the physical surveillance of the hill to the digital surveillance of the past. He began reviewing the vast archive of public statements, media appearances, and personal online postings made in the weeks and months following the child's disappearance. He was not looking for emotion. He was looking for anomalies. He found one almost immediately. It was a photograph, widely circulated at the time. It depicted the father and a close male friend, another key member of the circle, mid-stride, jogging. The image was intended to convey resilience, a portrait of two men battling their grief through rigorous, healthy activity. But what struck Stellander was not the action, but the location. They were jogging on a specific, recognizable uphill path. In the background, visible and symbolic, stood the local church, a place that the family had publicly adopted as their center for prayer and hope. To Stellander, this photograph was not a candid moment of exercise. It was a performance. It was an act of what he termed controlled visibility. Why that specific route? Why with that specific friend? And why allow it to be photographed? It was, he theorized, an act of psychological anchoring. It was a way of embedding themselves, visually and publicly, into the very topography of the area. It was a way of normalizing their presence on that hill. This suspicion, however, was just a professional hunch until he dug deeper. He continued his review of the digital archive and found the source code for his suspicion, the father's own blog. Amidst the many entries filled with emotional appeals and updates on the search, one post stood out for its bizarre and clinical tone. It was a post written by the father, describing in detail the very jog captured in the photograph. Stellander read the words, and a familiar coldness settled over him. The father wrote about the route. He described the incline. He mentioned the turns. It was written less like a journal entry from a grieving parent and more like a technical manual, a dry recitation of physical data. And then, buried within this sterile description, was the detail that set every one of Stellander's investigative alarms ringing. The father claimed, with absolute specificity, that the jog from their holiday apartment to a particular marker on that hill took 19 minutes. 19, not around 20, not a long run. 19. Stellander read the sentence again, and again. The specificity was a siren. In his experience, people dealing with profound, life-altering trauma do not typically operate with this kind of banal precision. Grieving fathers do not, as a rule, click a stopwatch. People who are constructing a timeline, however, do. The number 19 felt artificial. It felt rehearsed. It was a piece of data being deliberately and publicly logged. It was a statement of fact being entered into the official record, disguised as a casual blog post. Stellander's mind immediately began to work on the why. Why this number? Why this post? He formed a hypothesis. The 19-minute claim was not a memory. It was a fabrication. And it was a fabrication with a purpose. But he could not operate on theory alone. He had to test the claim. He returned to the resort town, not as a pilgrim watcher, but as a forensic analyst. He found the apartment building. He found the starting point of the run, as described in the blog. He located the exact marker on the hill, the one visible near the church. He set his own stopwatch. He began the run. He was not a young man, nor an elite athlete, but he was fit. He maintained a steady, consistent pace, the exact kind of pace a resilient man, as depicted in the photograph, would hold. He followed the described route perfectly, up the winding incline. He reached the marker. He stopped the watch. He stared at the time. It read 12 minutes. A 7-minute discrepancy. This was not a small error. This was not a rounding mistake. It was a chasm. Stellander, ever the Methodist, reset the watch. He did it again. This time, he forced a much slower pace, a near walk on the steepest parts, imagining a man tired from lack of sleep and stress. He arrived again. The watch read just over 12 minutes. He did it a third time, running faster, pushing himself. Even then, he could not stretch the time beyond 13. The 19-minute claim was an impossibility. It was a lie. He stood at the marker, the implications of this discovery settling on him. This was not just a lie. It was a functional lie. It was an act of narrative engineering. So, what did this 7-minute buffer, this fabricated window of time, do? First, it achieved the goal of the photograph. It publicly and factually anchored the father and his friend to that specific hill. It normalized their presence. Should anyone, a local or a police officer, have seen them in that area at another time, perhaps not jogging, it would seem less suspicious. It was, after all, their jogging route. Second, and more disturbing, it created a flexible timeline. It flooded the public narrative with a piece of information that was simultaneously specific and uselessly vague. It was a time that could be stretched, a window that could, perhaps, be used to cover other activities, other moments. Stellander saw it as a preemptive strike, a piece of manufactured evidence. The mother, in her secret grief, was tied to the hill through a private ritual. The father, in his public performance, was tied to the same hill through a public fabrication. The hill was the center. The jog was not exercise. It was not resilience. It was, Stellander concluded, an act of narrative defense. It was the construction of an alibi. Stellander now had a fixed, verifiable data point. The mother's visit, captured, timed, and analyzed, had moved his silent pilgrimage theory from the realm of psychological speculation into the world of observable fact. He had proven her connection to Spot 1. The question that immediately consumed him was whether this connection was solitary. Was this her secret, a private ritual of grief unknown to her husband? Or was this a shared, known location? His surveillance continued. The silent, hidden eyes of his cameras kept their watch. He knew, from the evidence of the 19-minute jog, that the father was already anchored to the hill. He had publicly documented his presence there. But that jog was a performance, a piece of narrative engineering to normalize his proximity. It was a public act. What Stellander needed to know was whether the father also had a private relationship with the hill. Specifically, did he know about the shrine? Stellander retrieved the next batch of data from his cameras. More time had passed. He sat again in the sterile quiet of his review, the click of the mouse, the only sound as he dismissed file after file. The false positives, the swaying branches, the nocturnal animals. The work was methodical, tedious, and necessary. And then, just as before, the monotony was shattered. A new file, a new timestamp, a new human presence. He did not need to lean in to recognize the figure. It was the father. Stellander paused the frame, his mind racing. The father was at Spot 1. This was the confirmation. The knowledge of this exact, remote location was not solitary, it was shared. He took a steadying breath and pressed play. He was not just watching, he was analyzing. He was comparing. He was looking for the behavioral patterns he had seen in the mother. They were entirely, chillingly, absent. The mother's visit had been a ritual of grief. She had knelt. She had brought an offering. Her focus was internal, her posture one of sorrow. She was a pilgrim. The father's visit was a procedure of inspection. He did not walk with the slow, mournful pace of a pilgrim. He walked with the brisk, focused energy of a man on a task. He arrived at the clearing and, unlike the mother, he did not immediately fix his gaze upon the heart of stone. Instead, his first action was to scan the perimeter. Stellander watched, mesmerized. The father's head turned, his eyes sweeping the area surrounding the clearing. He was not looking at the shrine. He was looking around it. He was checking the approaches. He was, Stellander realized with a jolt, checking for signs of disturbance. He was checking to see if anyone else had been there. This was not the behavior of a mourner. This was the behavior of a sentinel. Only after he had completed this 360-degree scan of the perimeter did the father turn his attention to the shrine itself. He stepped closer. He looked down at the heart of stones, the M of twigs, and the items the mother had left. He did not kneel. He did not touch them. He brought no flower, no offering. He simply observed. He stood over the items, his posture one of clinical assessment. He was, Stellander concluded, taking inventory. He was confirming that everything was as it should be. He was checking, verifying, and ensuring the site was, and remained, undisturbed. The entire visit lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It was efficient. It was functional. It was devoid of any visible emotional ritual. And then, his inspection complete, he turned and walked away, disappearing back down the path. Stellander rewound the footage. He watched it again. And a third time. The contrast with the mother's visit was stark, and it was perfect. It was the other half of the equation. The mother, trapped by a grief she could not publicly express, came to Spot 1 to perform her emotional duty. She came to mourn. The father, bound by the logistics of a secret, came to Spot 1 to perform his practical duty. He came to check. The implications were staggering. Stellander now had both parents, the two central figures in the entire global drama, captured on video, engaging in two separate, secret, and complementary behaviors at the exact same hidden, unmarked location. The 19-minute jog now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The public jog was the cover story. It was the alibi he created in the full view of the world's media, a public performance that justified, in his own mind and in the public record, his presence on that hill. The public run was the excuse for the private inspection. The question that Stellander now faced was no longer, did they know about this spot? The question was, why would a father, who publicly maintains his daughter was abducted by an intruder from an apartment, be secretly inspecting a patch of dirt on a remote hill, as if he were checking the security of a site he was responsible for? He did not look like a man searching for a child. He looked like a man managing a secret. Bernd Stellander now possessed a complete, closed loop of behavioral evidence. He had the mother's private ritual. He had the father's public alibi and his private inspection. He had proven, to his own satisfaction, that Spot 1 was a location of shared, secret, and profound significance to them both. But a question of pure logistics now consumed him. A terrible, practical question that turned his stomach, but one his military mind demanded he answer. How? If his primary hypothesis held, that the child had passed away on the 2nd of May, then a cascade of unavoidable, practical problems would have begun. The days that followed were not a time of quiet concealment. They were a period of intense, chaotic, and global scrutiny. The world's media, the police, and the public had descended upon the small resort. He reasoned that moving a child's remains in that environment would have been an impossibility. The risk of discovery would have been absolute. So, he theorized, they would have had to wait. They would have had to endure the media storm, performing their public grief, all while harboring a secondary, more terrible secret, that the child was not gone, but was hidden. Hidden somewhere temporary, somewhere close, somewhere accessible. This theory required an almost inhuman level of cold, patient calculation. Stellander turned his focus away from the hills and back to the paper trail. He was no longer looking for emotion. He was looking for tools. He was looking for the method of transport. He found it in the rental agreements. The family had not hired a vehicle immediately. For weeks, they were largely stationary, surrounded by police and supporters. But then, Stellander found the invoice. On the 27th of May, a full 25 days after the child was reported missing, they rented a silver Renault Scenic. The date was a lightning bolt. 25 days. To Stellander, this delay was not incidental. It was functional. What happens in 25 days? Media attention, while still high, would have begun to normalize. The suffocating, 24-hour-a-day press of the initial weeks would have settled into a more predictable rhythm. The police presence would have shifted from a frantic search to a procedural investigation. It created a window. More importantly, it solved the terrible, practical problem. The 25-day gap allowed the natural process of decomposition to advance. It was a grotesque, but necessary, part of his hypothesis. After 25 days, transport would be simpler, more contained. The car was the missing link. The 25-day delay was the time needed to secure the vehicle that would finally move the child's remains from a temporary, panicked hiding place to a final, permanent, ritualistic one. The car, he concluded, was not hired for running errands. It was hired for a single, specific purpose. It was the vehicle that bridged the gap between the initial tragedy and the final secret at Spot 1. Stellander's hypothesis about the Renault Scenic was, for now, purely theoretical. It was a logical bridge, but he needed a physical one. He needed forensic corroboration. He went back to the archives, this time pulling the original, controversial, and often dismissed Portuguese and British forensic reports. He was not interested in the public summaries. He wanted the raw data. He found the reports from the specialist dog handler, Martin Grime. Stellander understood the significance of this. These were not generic police dogs. These were elite, highly trained biological detection animals. He found the report for the first dog, Eddie. Eddie was a cadaver dog, trained to detect the specific, unique chemical compounds of human decomposition, even months or years after the fact. The handler's report was clinical and chilling. Eddie was introduced to the apartment, to the family's possessions, and then to the Renault Scenic. In the car, Eddie's behavior, which had been neutral, changed instantly. The dog gave a strong and immediate alert. Not a faint interest, not a possibility. An alert. The target of the alert was the boot area. Stellander then read the report for the second dog, Keela. Keela was not a cadaver dog. Keela was a blood dog, trained to detect microscopic, invisible traces of human blood. Keela was introduced to the vehicle, and, in the exact same location in the boot where Eddie had alerted to decomposition, Keela gave a strong and immediate alert for the presence of blood. Two different dogs, trained for two different, specific human traces, both alerting, independently, to the same small area of a car that was hired 25 days after the child had vanished. This, for Stellander, was already overwhelming. But there was more. He found the DNA analysis from the samples lifted from that exact spot in the boot. The reports were complex. There was not a full DNA profile, a fact that the family's defenders had used to dismiss the finding. But Stellander was not a lawyer. He was an analyst. The partial profile that was recovered matched 15 out of 19 of the child's genetic markers. Stellander sat back. He understood statistics. He understood probability. To find a partial match of that significance, in the exact location where a cadaver dog and a blood dog had both alerted, in a car hired 25 days after the fact, was not a coincidence. It was a conclusion. He then found a final, bizarre anomaly from that period. The mother's decision to wash the child's favorite stuffed toy, Cuddle Cat. This single act had baffled him. A parent clinging to hope would preserve such an item, a sacred link. They would not wash it. But now, he understood. The toy, which had likely been with the child, would have absorbed the same sense that Eddie the dog was trained to find. The washing, he theorized, was not an act of hygiene. It was an act of unconscious, or perhaps conscious, erasure. The 25-day gap, the cadaver alert, the blood alert, the 15 out of 19 DNA match, and the washed toy, they were not separate, circumstantial facts. They were a single, cohesive, and terrible story. Stellander had his case. He had the when, the 2nd of May. He had the why, the sedation and the accident. He had the where, Spot 1. He had the how, the 25-day wait, and the Renault Scenic. He had built a fortress of behavioral analysis and forensic corroboration. But it was all historical. It was all a study of the past. He was a good investigator, but he was also a predator of behavior. He knew that a secret this large, a secret still being actively guarded by the pilgrimages and the inspections, was not a dead thing. It was alive. And if it was alive, it was vulnerable. He decided to move from passive observation to active provocation. He would, he decided, set a trap. He needed to see how the guardians of this secret would react to a direct, external threat. He would not, of course, reveal himself. He would become a ghost, a new, unknown variable in their controlled world. He devised a psychological test. He would send a message, one designed not to accuse, but to panic. It had to be vague enough to be terrifying, and urgent enough to demand an immediate reaction. It had to sound, he thought, like a co-conspirator whose nerve was breaking. He spent days drafting the few, perfect words. He created an anonymous, untraceable email account. The message was a whisper of digital smoke. "It's about to be discovered. We can delay them a week." That was all. No names, no locations, no demands. An innocent person, he reasoned, upon receiving such a cryptic, menacing message, would have one of two reactions. They would delete it as insane spam, or they would, in terror, forward it to the police. A person guarding a secret, however, would not. A person with something to hide, a person with a specific location they feared discovering, would have a third, very different reaction. They would, he hypothesized, go and check the site. He chose his target. Not the parents directly. They were too insulated. He sent the email to a close, trusted member of the circle. A person he knew from his research was a central pillar of the family's support network. A person who would, without question, pass the warning on. The email was sent. The trap was set. Stellander returned his focus to the hidden cameras at Spot 1. This, he knew, was the endgame. He would now observe the reaction. He would not just be watching history. He would be watching his own experiment in real time. He waited. The wait was unbearable. For 1 day, there was nothing. For 2 days, nothing. The silence from his digital provocation was absolute. He began to feel a creeping, professional dread. Had he miscalculated? Had he overplayed his hand? Perhaps the secret was dead, buried not just under the stones on that hill, but under 17 years of time. Perhaps they no longer cared. He waited. A week passed. Still, the cameras at Spot 1 recorded nothing but the wind. He retrieved the data cards, his hope fading. He sat down for another long, monotonous review. He was now almost 2 weeks past the date he had sent the email. He clicked through the empty files. Nothing. 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 And then, a trigger. A human form. He stopped. His heart, which had been steady, now hammered. He did not recognize the man at first. It was not the father. He enhanced the image. He cross-referenced it with his files. It was the friend. The same friend who had been on the 19-minute jog with the father all those years ago. A core member of the circle. The man who had been publicly anchored to the hill alongside the father. Stellander pressed play, his focus absolute. The man's behavior was not that of a pilgrim. He was not grieving. He was not checking. He was tense. He arrived at the clearing, but his first move was not to the shrine. His first move was to scan the perimeter, just as the father had, but with a palpable, nervous energy. He looked up the path. He looked down the path. He peered into the brush. He was, Stellander realized, scouting. He was performing reconnaissance. He was checking for threats. He was checking to see if it was, in fact, about to be discovered. Only after he had cleared the area did he approach the shrine. He looked at it, but did not touch it. He seemed to be verifying its state, just as the father had. The email had worked. It had triggered a profound, panicked reaction. But the reaction was even more illuminating than Stellander had hoped. The parents, upon receiving the threat, had not gone themselves. That would be too risky. They had sent a trusted lieutenant. They had dispatched a soldier, their closest and most loyal friend, to go first and assess the danger. The secret was not just active. It was shared. It was defended. And Spot 1 was the objective. The scout finished his assessment, appeared to be satisfied that the site was not, in that moment, under surveillance, and then he left, as quickly as he had arrived. Stellander did not have to wait long for the second phase. He knew, with the certainty of a behavioral scientist who has just proven his hypothesis, what would happen next. The scout would return. He would deliver his report. The site is clear. No one is there. It was a false alarm. And then, and only then, would the principal guardians of the secret feel safe enough to go and verify the site for themselves. He retrieved the camera data from the following day. There they were. The camera trigger was time-stamped just hours after the scout had departed. The footage was clear. This time, it was not the mother alone. It was not the father alone. It was both of them. The mother and the father, arriving together. Stellander watched the final piece of his puzzle click into place. This visit was unlike all the others. It was not the emotional, private grief of the mother's pilgrimage. It was not the clinical, solo inspection of the father. This was a joint, functional, operational visit. They arrived without ceremony. There were no flowers, no photographs, no symbols of grief. They walked directly to the clearing, stood side by side, and looked down at the heart of stones. They were not mourning. They were confirming. They were looking at the site that the anonymous email had threatened. They were verifying with their own eyes that it remained undisturbed. Their presence was quiet, tense, and brief. They exchanged a few words, invisible to his microphones. They looked, they saw, and they were satisfied. And then, as one, they turned and walked away. This, Stellander knew, was the checkmate. This was the moment his entire investigation had been building toward. Their reaction to an anonymous, external threat was not to call the police. It was not to sound the alarm. Their reaction was to bypass all official channels, to dispatch a scout to a secret, unmarked grave site, and then, when the all-clear was given, to go themselves, in secret, to ensure their secret was still safe. These were not the actions of victims. These were not the actions of parents searching for a child. These were the actions, he concluded, of custodians of a location, and guardians of a terrible, irreversible secret. Bernd Stellander had his truth. He had watched it unfold, from a linguistic slip in a memoir to a shared, secret visit to a hidden shrine. He had, in his own mind, closed the case. But one final, vast anomaly remained. It was, perhaps, the most impenetrable mystery of all: the circle. The group of friends, the Tapas 7 as they were once known, who were with the family on the night of the 3rd of May. For 17 years, that wall of silence had not cracked. Not one person, not one slip, not one I misremembered. They had all, in unison, maintained the same, synchronized, flawed timeline. They had all repeated, sometimes verbatim, the same sequence of events, the same checks on the children, the same casual dinner. Stellander did not believe in this kind of human perfection. He knew that if you ask 7 people what they had for lunch yesterday, you will get 7 different answers, 7 different times, 7 different details. To have 7 people recite the same story of a traumatic night for 17 years was not a marvel of human memory. It was, to him, a marvel of human discipline. He dismissed the notion of loyalty. Loyalty, in his experience, was a fragile, emotional bond. It shattered under pressure, guilt, and time. 17 years of pressure would have broken mere loyalty. No, this was something far stronger. This was fear. He called it psychological entrapment. He laid out the logic. In the beginning, in those first panicked hours on the 3rd of May, the story was created. It was a small lie. A lie of omission, perhaps, or a lie to protect their friends, to cover for a moment of panic or a terrible, irreversible error. But that small lie did not stay small. It became the foundation of the entire global investigation. They told it to the Portuguese police. They told it to the British police. They told it to the world. And with every repetition, the lie grew stronger. It hardened. It became, in their own minds, the truth. To contradict that story now, 17 years later, would be impossible. It would not be a clarification. It would be a confession. A confession to what? A confession to obstructing justice. A confession to perjury. A confession, perhaps, to being an accessory after the fact to a terrible concealment. Their professional lives, as respected doctors and professionals, their families, their very identities, were now built upon that 17-year-old story. They were trapped. They were no longer just friends. They were co-conspirators, bound not by affection, but by a shared, mutually assured destruction. If one of them cracked, they all fell. They were not, Stellander concluded, protecting a person. They were protecting themselves from the total, catastrophic collapse of their entire lives. Their silence was not a pact. It was a prison, and it was a fortress. Bernd Stellander sat in the quiet, surrounded by his files. The video loops, the timelines, the maps, the forensic reports. The product of 7 years of his own life, a solitary obsession to find a pattern in the noise. He had found it. He had the when, the 2nd of May. He had the where, spot 1. He had the how, the car, the concealment. He had the who, the parents, in their shared, secret visits. And he had the why, the wall of silence built by the circle. He had a perfect behavioral case. And yet, he knew it meant nothing. He had no body. He had no confession. He realized in this final cold moment of clarity that this was the entire point. This was the true genius of the concealment. If there is no body, there is no crime. This is the fundamental principle. A missing person case can remain a missing person case indefinitely. It can be investigated, it can be searched for, it can be wept over in public for 17 years or more. But it can never become a homicide investigation. It can never lead to a prosecution. Because to prosecute for a death, you must first have proof of death. The entire, vast, global search, the media appeals, the hope, all of it, he concluded, was a performance. It was a necessary, theatrical production designed to maintain one single crucial illusion, that the child was missing and not gone. As long as she is missing, she cannot be dead. And as long as she cannot be dead, no one can be held responsible. The silence of the circle was the defense. The lack of a body was the fortress, and the public performance of grief was the distraction. Stellander looked at his wall. He had found the truth. He had documented it, proven it to himself beyond any doubt. And he knew, with that same certainty, that it was a truth that could never be spoken in a court of law. Justice was not just denied. It had been, from the 2nd of May, rendered completely and permanently impossible. The investigation, however, does not end here. The vigil continues. The cameras, whether mechanical or human, are always watching. The truth, buried as it may be, never truly rests. We will meet again.